Lemke. Thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm kind of fangirling here because I really love your work so much. And
Oh,
I
thank
really,
you.
as I told you, I love Dopamine Nation. I think it's so well done. And I follow your interviews in the New York Times, and I'm like, oh, Anna Lemke.
Well, thank you.
She knows her stuff. So let's dive into it. You describe dopamine as a pleasure molecule, but also as something that also governs pain. So can you walk us through how this same chemical is responsible for both joy and suffering?
Well, I think to sort of widen the lens a little bit on that, away from one specific brain chemical or neurotransmitter, it's more that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. Or if you imagine like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, when we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other. And when we experience pleasure, one of the molecules in the brain that gets released in a dedicated neural circuit of the brain called the reward pathway is dopamine. And the more dopamine that's released, and the faster that it's released in the reward pathway in response to any stimulus, internal, external, a substance, a behavior, the more likely that substance or behavior is to be positive, reinforcing, or just something that our brains recognize as necessary for survival that we need to approach, explore, and possibly do again. So dopamine has become a kind of common currency for measuring the addictive potential of different substances and behaviors. And also we know that what happens in the brain as people get addicted is that this dopamine release mechanism goes awry in a very kind of predictable way.
So I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days, especially because I just came from a dance weekend and I do Scottish country dancing. I love it, but I get so much dopamine from this behavior. I get such a rush from it, and such a high, and I'm having so much joy that sometimes like then I'm experiencing the other side of the teeter-totter, and that's pretty natural, I guess, then on the Monday and the Tuesday after something like that.
Yeah, that's a nice example because we don't usually think of there being a hangover or a come down from like being in a show or performing. But in fact, very often people will describe that. I remember I was doing a podcast with Russell Brand, who's performed in front of very large live audiences. And he talked about how he would get a total rush from that and then a really hard come down, and then actually would use drugs like cocaine to sort of bring himself back up again. And that's quite common. And getting back to that teeter-totter, to understand, what's happening there, there are certain rules governing this teeter-totter balance, and the first and most important rule is that the balance wants to remain level with the ground, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, such that with any deviation from neutrality, whether to the side of pleasure or pain, our brains are going to work very hard to restore a level balance. The way our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus is. So if we do something that's pleasurable, reinforcing, that releases dopamine, the reward pathway, the balance tilts to the side of pleasure, but then our brain adapts by down-regulating dopamine transmission. I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they don't get off on its level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that is the hangover, the come down, the blue Monday, or when you get back from a weekend of Scottish dancing, you're like, what is the meaning of my life? Why do I do what I do? Or whatever, kind of like the negative ruminations. Now, if we wait long enough without re-exposing ourselves to whatever our pleasurable reward is, then those gremlins get the message that their job is done. They hop off and homeostasis is restored. But if we continue to expose our brains over years, over days to weeks to months to years, that initial deflection to the pleasure side gets weaker and shorter in duration. That's called tolerance. But that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. And you can imagine that as these gremlins multiplying. And eventually they're kind of camped out there, tents and barbecues in tow. And now we've entered addicted brain, where we've changed our hedonic or joy set point so that we're chronically in a dopamine deficit state, tilt to the side of pain, such that we need more of our drug in more potent forms, not to get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when we're not using, we're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving.
Oh my gosh. And yeah, and when you're talking about these addictive substances and dopamine, you're talking about a lot of different things here that are kind of tilting us in the side. I mean, I can imagine as you're describing the that when the addictive piece, when we have to sort of get our fix just to feel normal, like I can picture that in the instance of addicted to codeine, or drugs like that. But then when you in Dopamine, you describe this in a lot of different activities and substances, including like video games and smartphones and romance novels and all kinds of things. So tell me just a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, anything that is pleasurable or rewarding will release dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, and that doesn't make it bad, right? If it didn't release dopamine, we wouldn't want to do it again, and there are things that we need and want to do again that are necessary for survival, right? The basic natural rewards are food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate. If we weren't programmed, if we weren't programmed to want those things, we would have died out, many, many hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it's not that dopamine is evil or we want less dopamine. The problem is that we have applied science and technology to make very potent forms of these natural rewards, to the point where it's way more than our brains can handle, where we get like this fire hose of dopamine. We get it chronically in a way that our brain was not evolved for, and also in a way that humans haven't had to deal with, except for like the last 200 years. Maybe just like take opioids, for example. For most of human existence, or for more than 2,000 years, people have used opium from the poppy plant, right? But they had to have a bit of soil to cultivate poppies, and then they had to grow them and wait till they were blooming, and then they had to harvest them, and then there was only so much, and when it ran out, you had to start over again. Now we have taken our technology to the point where we can make opioids in a laboratory without any plant precursors, and we can make an incredibly potent form, 100 to 1,000 times more potent than opium. And we have needles that we can inject, into our bodies that didn't exist before. My point being, that shift with a drug as old as opium, we now have with almost everything that we do. We've drugified our food supply. We've drugified human connection with social media, right? Where now we have likes and comments and shares at scale, quantified to sometimes millions of people. If we don't like what we see, we can swipe right and swipe left and go find something else. So the point being that by making many different natural rewards more accessible, more potent, more novel, and more bountiful, we've essentially drugified the modern world, making all of us more vulnerable to addiction, but also more vulnerable to these chronic dopamine deficit states that mimic clinical depression, anxiety, irritability, attention deficit disorder. And that's kind of really the point of Dopamine Nation, that modern life is difficult in wholly unprecedented ways because of this mismatch between our ancient wiring that has us reflexively approaching pleasure and avoiding pain, and the world that we find ourselves in, where we can just sit on the couch and with the press of the button have access to all these drugified goods.
It makes sense, but it's also so strange in some ways that this world of abundance, right, where we have free time, where we have yummy food, we have fruit all year round, where we have so much entertainment, all of this stuff. A lot of us, a lot of people listening to this podcast anyway, you live in relative safety. All of this stuff is happening. And yeah, and then we're seeing that, kids are more anxious, adults are more anxious than ever. People in societies like the United States are more anxious than in places that don't have all of this stuff. And so it's so paradoxical because I wouldn't want to go back in any way, shape, or form. Like maybe, actually, I was thinking that maybe, how like the Amish and the Mennonite, we have them around here in Pennsylvania. They've stopped technology at like sort of a certain point in time, and they're kind of going through. And I was thinking, oh, maybe we could just, we could just get a society that stops technology around 2000, like pre-smartphone. Like we've got the internet, we can have information, but we can stop it pre-smartphone. But like, it's frustrating that we wouldn't want to change it in any way, right? But it's hard to go back against those comforts. But it's so frustrating that these comforts are what you're pointing to is the fact that they are actually making us like sort of more uncomfortable and more anxious.
Well, the Amish are a great example because the Amish community illustrates how the adoption of any technology that is beyond what you need for subsistence living is going to entail pros and cons, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Amish is in a community that got to a point of productive farming beyond which they said, we don't want to adopt technology beyond this because what we will lose is our club goods. Now, club goods is a behavioral economics term for the intangible benefits that people get from living in communities that are really core also to our basic needs and our survival, right? Our attachment to each other. And so, the Amish, through their spirituality, basically had this aha moment, really a revelation that more technology in our lives is going to take away from our spiritual community. And I feel like, the rest of us living in the modern world are thirsting, on a deep spiritual and communal level, in large part because we have continued to adopt, the technology that makes our lives so convenient and so comfortable and so interesting in so many ways, but also has these enormous detriments to it in the spheres of social and emotional well-being, in the sphere of human attachment versus alienation and loneliness, in the sphere of purpose and meaning versus nihilism and alienation. So it's a double-edged sword. It's a kind of, the golden handcuffs, whatever you want to call, whatever metaphor or idiom you want to use, there's a price to pay for this comfort.
Yeah, I'm seeing it a lot. Hence my strong attachment to my Scottish dancing. But
yeah, that's a nice, right? That's physical, it's social. Yeah, so when you leave that, you probably feel lonely when you get away from that wonderful shared communal activity.
Sometimes, yeah. I just go to dance class 2 days later, but that's okay.
Well, there you go.
So let's look at the smartphone, right? Because it's really, I feel like it's really accelerated, and it's really something that really concerns me a lot. But anyway, it's been called the modern day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 for the wired generation. So
I called it that. That's
you did
me.
it. You did it. Okay, great.
That's from Dopamine Nation. Yeah.
I thought that might have been. It's like, I can't find it. Anyway, I'm just going to say it's been called. All right. Well, can you tell us, Anna, how do smartphones affect the neurochemical balance for both, thinking from the lens also of both parents and children?
Yeah, well, let's look at the origins of the metaphor. Like I said, opium from the poppy plant has been around for millennia. In the early 1800s, morphine was isolated from opium, and they could do that in a laboratory. And it's, approximately 10 times more potent than opium. And then when you add two acetyl groups to morphine, you get heroin, which was discovered in the late 1800s. But between the discovery of morphine and heroin, there was the invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s. And the original idea behind the hypodermic syringe was that it would be a way to administer morphine such that people would not get addicted to morphine, because there were already problems with serious addiction. And of course, that completely backfired, right? Because intravenous anything really, because of the rapid uptake in the brain, is going to be even more addictive than if you eat it or drink it or smoke it. And so when I talk about the smartphone being the hypodermic syringe, delivering digital dopamine, what I'm saying is that I'm not sure that the smartphone itself is the drug, but it's the delivery mechanism that allows for 24 access to the digital drugs that are now available on the internet. For example, addictive forms of social media. Not all social media is designed to be addictive, but most of the most popular types of social media are engineered to be addictive. What do I mean by that? I mean that they rely on our need for social validation, reciprocity, and group belonging. And the likes, the shares, the comments, the posts, the enumeration at scale, meaning that we're now quantifying how many people have liked it and shared our comments, the rapid turnaround, because kinetics matter when it comes to addiction. If we had to wait a really long time to get a response to our post, trust me, nobody would be posting. It's the fact that the response is almost immediate. That turnaround time is very reinforcing for our brains over that rapid time scale. And all of that together means that social media, certain types of social media, have essentially drugified human connection. We know human connection releases dopamine in the reward pathway. That's why falling in love feels good. But what's happened with social media is, with almost no upfront effort, we've distilled social connection down to its most reinforcing elements. And people are now on social media nominally to connect with other people, but really what they're doing is just delivering dopamine to their reward pathway. It's the medium itself that is the drug, and the smartphone is the way that we get it 24/7 wherever we are, in the bathroom, in the bedroom, at the dining table. And we know that people who develop a digital media addiction, whether it's social media or pornography or online games or online shopping or whatever it is, the pattern that they have is just like people have with cigarettes. The first thing in the morning, they light up, they reach for their phones, and then they reach for the phone multiple times all through the day. And then when they get to the night time and the willpower is down and they're more tired, then they go on, the sort of endless scroll or the binge watching, or and we're all vulnerable to it, right? I mean, we can all relate to this phenomenon. Oh, I was just going to go and watch one YouTube video, and 2 hours later, I'm watching these completely ridiculous YouTube videos. So things like that, I think, is something that so many people are experiencing now. And it's because the digital media are highly reinforcing and potentially addictive.
Yeah, I'm seeing that behavior obviously in my own family and myself. My dad, who's almost 80, is like, we were all sitting around watching TV, and he was on Facebook, and he's recently gotten into it, and he's really gotten into it. He's talking out loud about it and swiping and telling us things, and we're like, can you go do that somewhere else? But he's, and actually recently we've been talking with my 18-year-old, my husband and I, about, we were like, oh, this is it. Recently I'd been feeling it. I think I'd been feeling the effects of like the creep of the phone, just like the checking. And my husband, daughter, and I had considered, we were talking about getting like dumber phones, some kind of flip phone or something like that. But then Maggie, my daughter, I guess like a week and a half ago now, she said, Mom, give me your phone. And she took my phone and she got rid of Facebook, she got rid of Instagram, she got rid of the New York Times. She went through every single app and was like, "What is this? I'm getting rid of it.
Yeah,
No
okay.
more
That's
no
right.
more
Good for
digital
her.
thrifting for me
Right.
on ThredUp." She got rid of all the things, and actually the thing we did is we live in Delaware. We're just in the suburb of Philadelphia, so I actually subscribed to the Philadelphia paper to actually be physically
Great.
delivered to our house.
Wonderful.
So now I'm getting, so it's been this like week actually leading up to this conversation with you of like a week and a half of like some changes and some shifts, and
Nice.
I've been feeling some clarity, some more clarity. It feels like it was cluttering up my brain, and I wonder with this idea of the smartphone as the modern hypodermic needle delivering the digital dopamine, it's affecting people in a way that really is negative, right? Like one thing I'm noticing, and I don't know, maybe you can confirm this or not, is that people seem sort of antisocial. Like
Hmm.
it is hard to get people out of their houses. And I'm wondering
Yes.
if it's like it's this is part of the problem about the way this reward pathway is stimulated. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the great irony of this technology that, the technology allows us to connect with each other without leaving our homes or even our couches for that matter. And yet, at the same time, the technology is driving us further apart.
Yeah.
More people than ever before live alone. Young people now endorse preferring online communication to actually having face to face communication. The majority, or at least half of young people, endorse preferring online communication.
Mm.
More and more people are not leaving their homes. They're recreating in their homes. It's like the trajectory. You wonder if we're all going to turn into like human versions of moles, right? Who just sort of live indoors and never
The
go out
Wally,
anymore, right?
the Wally
Yes,
pod people.
right. Yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, and it's funny because when you first said antisocial, I was thinking about the psychiatric notion of antisocial, which is not, not social, although that's happening too, and I think that's what you were alluding to. But the antisocial personality disorder, where people are like sociopathic and
Mm.
are no longer they're lacking in integrity and morals, and that also happens, right?
Oh,
Because
wow.
because all of this information, more information than our brains were processed, and all the normalization of this kind of deviant speech and deviant behaviors online, I think has contributed to a decay of morality more broadly, where just people kind of feel like, anything goes and I can sort of
Mm.
say whatever I want. And the sort of civil discourse that we took for granted is now actively threatened. So, both in terms of it limiting our socialization, but also contributing to a kind of a sociopathy. I think that element is there. Again, there are great things about the technology, right? You and I are
Yeah.
having this conversation, couldn't
Yeah.
have it otherwise. There's all kinds of opportunities to connect and learn and, appreciate things that we otherwise couldn't appreciate. Marginalized people, have the
Hmm.
ability to get. So there are many good things, but there are clearly also many bad things. And I think it's good that we're having the conversation about the bad things,
Hmm.
so that we can individually and collectively think about how do I want to be in relationship with the technology? I love what your daughter did. Love it. I love that you're getting, a regular paper. First of all, you're supporting a dying industry,
Mm.
which is the newspaper industry, but also that kind of slowed down, slowed form, intentionally, slightly inconvenient way of consuming media. It is, I think, important to think about, right? Like, how do I want to get my information, and what is a way that is, uh, you know, kind of enriches my life to have this information versus detracting from my life. And everybody's going to maybe come down in a slightly different place. But I think most of us would agree we're sort of dealing with like not just information overload, but like sensationalized information overload. And especially kids, kids, we have to we have to protect kids and kids' brains. Kids' brains are vulnerable. The frontal lobe isn't fully wired up to the limbic system. The kids are
Hmm.
much more vulnerable to social judgment. They're much more social sensation seeking. They're much more likely to take risks, or at least they used to be. Now the risks are online, which are riskier in some ways. So, yeah, we have to think about, you know, how we're rewiring kids' brains with the technology.
Yeah, you said in the New York Times interview, we're spending more and more of our energy and creativity investing in the online world, which means that we are actually leeching a real life existence of our energy and creativity, so that when we try to re-enter the real world, it actually is more boring because
Right.
there's less going on, because there's nobody there. I was thinking about that, like where people are on their phones and they're getting these hits all the time. And so then it's kind of filling this need in a superficial way. So then they're not getting they're not the real life. It gets even less and less and less engaging, which is, I mean, that's horrifies me.
Yeah, I mean, it means now when your spouse comes home and tells you about their day at work, like you don't really want to listen because you'd rather go listen to your, celebrity update or something, right? So that's a problem. That's a
Yeah.
genuine problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you're not getting out of the house to do things with
Right.
friends, and then you're losing those social connections because you feel
Yeah.
you're getting a semblance of it. You feel like you kind of got it, but you didn't really. It's not a real
Right. I mean, it's
connection.
it's just so soothing. It's this machine that we can use to soothe ourselves. We get a little bit of a buzz. We're entranced, and then when we try to stop, we experience the come down. That happens when you have to stop using any drug, and then there's this huge activation energy required to get ourselves to do anything else because it's so much harder relative to just like scrolling and consuming media online. So, this gets right back to the pleasure pain balance. I mean, pleasure and pain relate to each other and they're relative, right? So if you're constantly consuming these soothing, pleasurable substances and behaviors, you're going to reset your hedonic threshold for what's pleasurable and what's painful.
I know it makes me think of, mindfulness, and I've studied mindfulness in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh and gone to the monasteries in the Plum Village tradition, Blue Cliff Monastery. And I think about that and how kind of what we do when we go on a retreat there is that we are retraining ourselves to, and they are actively helping to train everybody who comes to find pleasure in things like the sound of the rain,
Mm-hmm.
or to find pleasure in the feeling of breathing or remembering that you are alive, or the feeling of your footsteps walking or walking together through the woods, collectively. The feeling of eating and the satisfaction of that. And it's interesting, and it's like really distilling down. It's almost like, you talk about abstinence, right? And your sort of dopamine um, way of kind of combating that, and it's kind of like taking abstinence, was also actively encouraging and reminding people that you can find pleasure in very, very simple, essential things.
Yeah, and I think we often think of abstinence as sort of denying ourselves rewards, but really what it means is that we'll reset our reward threshold such that simple pleasures become rewarding again, which is exactly what you're talking about. And I think that's what, it's not about denying ourselves pleasure or, always living in pain. It's about how this constant comfort seeking and pleasure seeking is actually creating the pain that many of us experience living in the modern world, and that to recapture some of that the joy of life means to eschew these quick pleasures, intentionally pursue things that are challenging and difficult, and thereby get back the simple joys.
Hmm. So, do you think that we as parents should try to prevent our children from experiencing dopamine spikes. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, it makes sense to me to, it makes sense to me to not expose our children to like constant comfort and pleasure and soothing, easy things. Um, I think to,
AKA
raise,
the iPad.
yeah, I think to raise healthy kids, they need challenge. I mean, we're really wired to strive. That's, how we evolved, and kids feel good and get a sense of competence when they overcome obstacles and difficulties, and that's what gives them, confidence to make it in the world. So yeah, I do think that I would recommend that.
Yeah, we in our family we had for most of until about a year ago we had a screen-free Sunday policy, and that was when and they had limited screen time and other times. And actually, the listener knows this because this podcast has already come out. I recently recorded an episode with my 18-year-old daughter where she actually thanked me for
Nice.
limiting her screen time
Mm-hmm.
when she was
Yeah.
little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But anyway, that is when the pleasure of the projects would come out, where the box would become the ship, and
Right.
all the different things,
Yeah.
and that's when that would come out. And it was just wonderful to see this kind of deep play
Mm-hmm.
where it goes on for multiple hours sometimes, and they're just absorbed in it. And you describe that in Dopamine Nation as like a kind of like the dopamine release of a project and the satisfaction and the sort of slow, steady thing. And that might be something that we're sort of aiming for, I suppose, with our kids by maybe denying them what everyone else in the neighborhood might be giving them. We might actually be giving them more.
Exactly. Yeah. And going back to that metaphor of the teeter-totter, those gremlins are actually agnostic to the initial stimulus. So if we intentionally press on the pain side, they will actually go over on the pleasure side, and we will get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. There's a whole branch of science called hormesis, and hormesis is a Greek term. It means to set in motion. And what we're setting in motion is the body's own healing, re-regulating mechanisms. There are more and more studies showing that when you expose all different kinds of animals to mild to moderate doses of painful or toxic stimuli, you actually make the organism healthier. They live longer, they're more agile, what have you. So this things like extreme cold, things like spinning in a centrifuge, just various kinds of physiologic stressors. And the same is true for humans. I mean, this is what we call the runner's high, right?
Oh, I
We
got
know
that
that.
once.
What's that?
I got that once.
Yeah, exactly. So we know that when we begin strenuous exercise, or exercise even as tolerated, it doesn't even have to be that strenuous, dopamine levels rise gradually over the latter half of the exercise, and then they remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back down to baseline levels of dopamine firing. And you never go into that dopamine deficit state that is characteristic of intoxicants, where we have that upward spike and then that downward deflection before going back to baseline, or in addiction, getting stuck in that downward deflection. So this is a better way to get our dopamine, because by getting it indirectly, we are protecting ourselves to some degree from the addiction cycle. Now, can people get addicted to pain? Absolutely. It's rare, but we do see things like people addicted to exercise, often combined with calorie restriction. And the intervention there is similar to what we would do for any kind of addiction. We'd have them abstain from exercise and calorie restriction, for a period of time to be able to reset reward pathways. We see people who cut, and the reason that they cut is because it releases endorphins, our endogenous opioids, which then releases dopamine, which feels good. People actually get high on that. And the intervention there, is that we would have people abstain from cutting for a period of 4 weeks. Again, that kind of dopamine fast early intervention until they get out of the state of craving, cutting, and find better, healthier, adaptive coping strategies. So the addiction lens can be useful for many different types of compulsive behaviors and substance use. But in general, we encourage people to do hard things as a way to accelerate resetting their reward pathways to a healthier level. And again, this can be exercise, it can be ice cold water plunges, it can even be things like meditation and prayer, which, when done consistently, do tend to be effortful and aren't like an immediate high for most people, but with sustained effort can lead to quieting the mind and really and release dopamine and improvements in that regard.
That's nice to hear that. And you talk about exercise in Dopamine Nation. On page 151, you say high levels of physical activity in junior high, high school, and early adulthood predict lower levels of drug use, which is so cool. It's interesting that you're describing it as this like pain thing, which is not how I think of it, because exercises are it's a must in my life, right? And people can't understand, I guess, like, or my kids watch me. Sometimes I do this body pump class, and sometimes I do it at home. I've got all the weights and I'm like lifting these heavy weights and doing like 5-6 minutes of squats in a row. But it's painful at the time, I guess you would say. I mean, that is, I don't really think of it that way, but the afterwards, for hours after, I feel so good. And if I'm in a bad mood, that completely turns me around.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
So yeah, you talk about in Dopamine Nation some of the antidotes to like our addictive nature. You just described some of them: meditation, exercise. When going back to our conversation about the smartphone, how would you what would you say to parents, and how can parents model healthy phone behavior and not go down that slippery slope of leaching their real world of energy and creativity?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say to parents, whatever you're doing now, it's never too late to do it a little differently. It's true that once your kids become teenagers, it gets much harder to intervene with those behaviors, especially if you've established certain norms in your household. It can be difficult to change those norms. But it can be done, with a lot of talking about it and consensus building, and also parents changing their behaviors too, not just expecting kids to change without parents also changing. In general, I say to parents that if you have a child under the age of 13, or even a little older, a child under the age of, let's say, 15, best to not give them their own personal device connecting to the internet. Wait as long as you possibly can. And then when you give that device, or you give approval for such a device, make sure that it comes with warnings and disclaimers. That is to say, you can give the device to take it away if the child is showing that they're really not able to moderate their use, or use in ways that are socially appropriate and safe. And have, etiquette, established, again, norms, digital etiquette around when it's appropriate to use the device and when it's not, like not at the dinner table, and not when we have friends visiting, and not when someone is trying to talk with you, and not when you're doing your homework, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I always encourage parents to get an alarm clock.
Oh yeah, really
Get your
basic. Mm-hmm.
get yourself an alarm clock, and don't use your phone for an alarm clock. Get all the phones out of the bedrooms, get
Right.
them into the living rooms, downstairs in the kitchen, whatever. Just that physical. It's, I guess, as I learned in Dopamine Nation, it's like a practice of binding. It's
Right.
keeping some barrier between you and the odd thing that is addictive.
That's right.
Yeah. So one more thing, in the end of Dopamine Nation, you talk about some antidotes to our addictive nature: awareness, radical honesty, and pro-social shame. And for me, it was like, okay, because I'm used to thinking of shame as kind of a destructive feeling, because shame is this thing that I am bad, whereas guilt is like, I did something bad. What is pro-social shame, and how do you see it as helping people?
Yeah, I mean, whether you call it shame or guilt, what we're basically talking about is related emotions where we we're we feel badly about something that we've done or said, or a regret. Typically, we might be inclined to lie about it in order to cover it up, because the fear of being rejected by our tribe is so overwhelming that we would rather hide it than be found out and risk that the fear of shunning. And shame can absolutely be a very negative thing and can perpetuate the problem of addiction, especially when combined with habitual lying, so that we lie about it, then we feel more shame, and then we use to cover up the shame, and then we lie some more. And you can get into this really vicious cycle, sometimes called malignant shame or toxic shame, that can drive addiction. On the other hand, if we didn't feel some degree of shame for these behaviors, we also wouldn't be motivated to change them. So in many ways, shame is possibly our most pro-social emotion, right? Because it's what gets us to adhere to certain types of expected behaviors that we need to adhere to in order to live in larger communities. And so the key to turning malignant shame into pro-social shame, I think, begins with truth telling. And that's this idea of radical honesty, which we actually prescribe to patients. We say, in addition to not using your drug of choice this month, we want you to engage in radical honesty. That means you can't tell any lies about anything. And the
Oh,
little
wow.
lies possibly matter more than the big lies. So you can't lie. You can't lie about why you were 5 minutes late for the meeting. You can't lie about what you had for breakfast. You can't lie about where you are, or what you're doing, or any of it. And what we find is that people in robust recovery from addiction have already naturally discovered that the lying habit is a harbinger and a part of addiction, whereas the truth-telling habit or radical honesty, rigorous honesty in AA, is really necessary to maintaining recovery. We're not exactly sure what the connection is. I mean, I speculate in the book that it's related to the prefrontal cortex, and that engaging in active honesty, which takes effort because we're natural liars, might actually strengthen our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex kind of acts like the brakes on the car when it comes
Yeah.
to appetitive control.
Yeah.
It's also true that when we're telling the truth, we promote intimacy, when we're making ourselves vulnerable to other people, being honest. We think that people are going to be repelled by the things we've done. But in fact, they see themselves in us, in our mutual flawed humanity, and it often fosters intimacy and brings people closer to us. And that's a great paradox, because we have a lot of resistance to being truthful about our, warts and all. But when we really do share, it is a way to bring people closer, and then that's a wonderful source of healthier, feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine. So yeah, so that's kind of the different. That's what I talk about when I talk about pro-social shame. That it has value as a pro-social emotion.
Well, Anna, there's so much here, dear listener. If you are interested in how the brain works, if you're interested in our addictive nature and just want to learn about it, I highly recommend Dopamine Nation. I was telling Anna before we started talking that I read a lot of books and get a lot of books that are about a lot of different things, and I really, really appreciate about how engaging Dopamine Nation is as a read. Um, and it includes so much incredible information as well. So, um,
Thank you.
go get it everywhere books are sold. It's been out for a while now, so maybe you already have it, and you can just tell her how great it is. But Anna, I really appreciate you coming, and I appreciate the way you've distilled your learning down into this way, and the way you share it with the world, with such um, measured steadiness and honesty. I find it all like super refreshing, and I'm a great fan. So anyway, thank you for coming on the podcast and everything
Well,
you've done.
thank you. Thank you for those kind words and for having me on your podcast.